The scorching African sun was merciless as I stepped outside the makeshift medical tent, wiping sweat from my brow. I had just finished a 6-hour emergency surgery on a young patient, and my body ached for rest. The familiar buzz of my phone cut through the ambient sounds of the busy medical camp, the chatter of local nurses, the whir of generators, and the distant calls of village life. The name on the screen made my heart sink. Marcus Blackwood. After years of dealing with my stepfather's manipulative games, I knew calls from him rarely brought anything but trouble. Still, a small part of me, perhaps the optimistic doctor in me that believed in healing, hoped this time might be different. Hello? I kept my voice professionally neutral, the same tone I used with difficult patients. Evelyn. His voice dripped with artificial cheer that made my skin crawl. Just thought you'd want to know, I've sold the mountain cabin. I froze, my grip tightening on the phone until my knuckles turned white. The sounds of the medical camp seemed to fade away, replaced by a hollow ringing in my ears. You did what? Sold it. He repeated with disturbing enthusiasm, as if announcing a celebration. Don't look so shocked, it's for the greater good of mine, obviously. His smug laugh echoed through the line, a sound that made my blood pressure spike in a way that would concern me as a doctor. My name is Dr. Evelyn Parker, and for as long as I can remember, Marcus Blackwood has been the cancer in my family's life. He married my mother when I was 15, worming his way into our lives with charm and calculated humor. But beneath that polished exterior was a man who treated others' possessions like chess pieces in his endless games of self-interest. The cabin wasn't just a vacation property, it was my sanctuary, a piece of my mother's legacy that I'd preserved through medical school and countless volunteer missions. It was where I recharged between grueling deployments with Doctors Without Borders, where I hosted fellow physicians for strategy sessions, and where I felt closest to my mother's memory. Hearing Marcus treat it like a poker chip made my carefully maintained professional composure crack. You had no right, I said, my voice trembling with the same intensity one reserved for confronting negligent parents. That cabin wasn't yours to sell. Relax, dear, Marcus drawled, his voice carrying that condescending tone he always used when he thought he was being clever. I've been managing things while you're off playing hero in Africa. And really, what's the point of a cabin you're never around to enjoy? It was an elegant solution to my temporary financial concerns. You'll thank me later. I'll thank you when hell freezes over, I snapped, ending the call before my medical ethics about doing no harm could be severely tested. I paced the narrow space between medical supply crates, my scrubs still bearing traces of the day's surgeries. The familiar scent of antiseptic did nothing to calm my racing thoughts. Marcus's audacity had reached new heights, but this time he'd made a critical error in judgment. What he didn't know, what I'd carefully kept from him, was that the cabin wasn't solely mine to sell. My best friend and fellow advocate for justice, Amelia Hayes, was co-owner. The environmental lawyer in her had insisted on a legally binding co-ownership agreement years ago, requiring both our signatures for any sale. I sank onto a metal folding chair, staring at my phone as if it might explode with another call from Marcus. My mind raced back to all the times he'd manipulated situations, each memory burning like antiseptic on an open wound. How could he think this was acceptable? Selling something so deeply personal to me as if it were just another asset in his portfolio of schemes. The cabin wasn't just property, it was my lifeline. It was where I spent summers with my mother before she married Marcus, where she taught me about the healing properties of local plants, sparking my interest in medicine. After her unexpected death, it became my anchor, the one place where I could still feel her presence guiding my path in medicine. Marcus, predictably, saw none of this. To him, it was just another asset to leverage, like everything else he'd exploited over the years. But this wasn't some minor transgression, this was my heritage, my haven between saving lives. With hands that had performed delicate surgeries just hours before, I tapped Amelia's contact information and waited for her to answer. "Hey Evelyn, caught you between surgeries?" Amelia's voice came through clear despite the distance, carrying the sharp focus she was known for in environmental law circles. "Marcus sold the cabin," I said, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. The medical tent's canvas walls suddenly felt suffocating. There was a pointed silence on her end, then, "He what?" Her tone carried the same intensity I'd heard her use in environmental protection cases. "Apparently, he needed to cover his gambling debts," I explained, my free hand instinctively organizing medical supplies, a habit that helped me think clearly. "He seems to think he has the authority to make unilateral decisions about the property. But our co-ownership agreement makes that legally impossible. He can't sell without your consent." Amelia let out a controlled breath, the same one she used before delivering closing arguments. That man's arrogance is truly breathtaking. Did he really think he could pull this off? "He has no idea about the legal safeguards we put in place," I said, finding some comfort in our preparation. "I'll wrap up this medical mission and head back as soon as I can. Could you pull up our documentation? I want to be ready to counter this the moment I land." "Already on it," Amelia replied with the efficiency that made her a formidable environmental advocate. "I'll have everything prepared. We're not letting him get away with this, Evelyn. Not this time." As I ended the call, a peculiar calm settled over me, the same focused state I entered before complex surgeries. Marcus thought he'd outsmarted me, assuming I was too occupied saving lives in Africa to challenge his betrayal. But he'd severely underestimated both me and my resources. I wasn't the intimidated medical student he used to manipulate. I was a skilled physician with a strong support system and an intimate understanding of how to fight for what's right. The next few days passed in a blur of medical procedures and patient consultations. Even as I treated malaria cases and conducted pediatric examinations, Marcus's betrayal lingered in my thoughts like a persistent infection. During brief breaks between patients, I found myself documenting everything in my medical journal, not patient notes this time, but memories of the cabin, the first time my mother showed me how to identify medicinal plants in the garden, the countless hours Amelia and I spent restoring the place, the peaceful evenings by the fireplace planning future medical missions. This wasn't just a building Marcus could gamble away, it was a crucial part of my identity as both a daughter and a doctor. Amelia's call came as I was updating patient charts in the quiet of the evening. "I've reviewed our co-ownership agreement," she said, her voice carrying the confident tone she used when preparing for environmental protection cases. "As we thought, any sale without my explicit consent is legally void. He's got absolutely no standing." Relief washed over me like the feeling after a successful surgery. "Have you found out who he tried to sell it to?" "Not yet," Amelia replied, keyboard clicks punctuating her words. "I've accessed the county records, but there's no official transfer of ownership recorded. Classic Marcus trying to operate in the shadows." "Sounds exactly like him," I said, organizing my medical supplies with practiced precision. "Always looking for shortcuts, always trying to manipulate the system." "What's our next move?" I asked, unconsciously using the same tone I used when consulting with other doctors on complex cases. "We have two options," Amelia responded, her legal mind already mapping out strategies. "We can either confront him directly, or we can let the legal system do the heavy lifting. Either way, the law is firmly on our side. He has no legal foundation for this sale." I released a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, feeling the tension ease from my shoulders. "Thanks, Amelia. I don't know where I'd be without you." You'd still be fighting the good fight, she said warmly, but it's better to have backup. We're in this together, just like we've always been. As I hung up, a strategy began forming in my mind, as clear as a surgical plan. I'd complete my remaining medical duties here, return home, and face Marcus head-on. But I wouldn't match his emotional manipulation with anger. That's what he'd expect from the stepdaughter he still saw as an impulsive teenager. Instead, I'd approach this like a difficult medical case, with calm precision, careful planning, and the backing of expertise. He thought he'd won, but he was about to learn that years of handling medical crises had taught me more than just how to save lives. When I finally walked into my apartment, the silence hit me differently than the bustling sounds of the medical camp I'd grown accustomed to. My potted medicinal herbs, carefully selected to remind me of the cabin's garden, had wilted slightly, and a stack of medical journals waited by the door. I had barely set down my medical bag when my phone buzzed. Marcus. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but my medical training had taught me that sometimes you have to face infections head-on. Well, if it isn't my globe-trotting stepdaughter, Marcus's voice oozed artificial warmth. Finally back from saving the world? What do you want, Marcus? I kept my tone clinical, the same one I used when delivering difficult diagnoses. Just checking in, he said, his smugness practically radiating through the phone. Making sure you're not too broken up about the cabin situation. Water under the bridge now, isn't it? Interesting you should say that, I replied, maintaining the calm demeanor I'd perfected in emergency rooms. Because according to the property records, the cabin isn't under the bridge at all. Amelia and I checked the ownership records. Your attempted sale never went through. There was a pause, the kind I'd heard countless times when delivering unexpected test results. Then, that's ridiculous, Marcus said, his voice tightening like a tourniquet. The buyer paid cash. The paperwork is done. It's finished. No, it's not, I stated, as firmly as I would when insisting on a necessary medical procedure. Amelia and I are co-owners. Remember? Without her consent, any sale is legally void. The cabin remains ours. His laugh came out brittle, like a failing vital sign monitor. You think you're so clever, don't you? Always the perfect doctor, always trying to control everything. You have no idea what I've been dealing with, Evelyn. I did what I had to do. You tried to steal from me, I countered, years of medical ethics strengthening my resolve. And you expect me to sympathize? You've made your choices, Marcus, and now you'll have to face the consequences. The line went dead as he hung up, leaving me standing in my apartment, phone in hand, feeling the same rush of adrenaline I got during successful resuscitations. For years, I'd allowed Marcus to manipulate situations, guilt-trip me, and take advantage of my demanding schedule. But not anymore. This wasn't just about protecting the cabin, it was about establishing healthy boundaries, something I routinely advocated for my patients but had struggled to implement in my own life. I sat at my kitchen table, my laptop open like a surgical tray laid out with instruments. The co-ownership agreement Amelia had sent over was as clear as a clean X-ray. Neither of us could sell the cabin without the other's written consent. Marcus's actions weren't just unethical, they were as blatantly wrong as a misdiagnosis. My focus was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door, carrying the same urgency as an emergency room alert. There stood Marcus, wearing his trademark self-assured expression, dressed in an expensive suit that probably cost as much as a month's worth of medical supplies. Mind if I come in? He didn't wait for an answer, striding into my apartment like he was entering his own private clinic. I crossed my arms, watching him settle into my chair with the same clinical detachment I used when observing difficult patients. What do you want, Marcus? Look, Evelyn, he began, his tone dripping with the kind of condescension I often heard from pharmaceutical representatives. "I know you're upset, but you have to understand my position." I was in a tight spot. The people I owed money to weren't exactly the patient type. I raised an eyebrow, the same way I did when catching an inconsistency in a patient's story. "And you thought selling property that wasn't yours was the solution?" "Borrowing," he corrected, as if changing the diagnosis would alter the symptoms. I was going to make it back. Once my luck turned around, I would have made everything right. I couldn't help but let out a laugh as bitter as strong antiseptic. "Your luck? That's what you're counting on, Marcus? You've been gambling away money since before my mother's death, and it's never worked out. What made you think this time would be different?" He shifted in his seat like an uncomfortable patient, but his facade quickly returned. "You're overreacting. It's just a cabin. You're hardly ever there with all your medical missions. Why not let someone else make use of it?" "Because it's mine," I said with the same conviction I used when insisting on life-saving procedures. "Because it's my sanctuary. You don't get to decide what I value or what I do with my property. And for the record, Amelia values it just as much as I do. Your attempted sale is as invalid as an unsigned prescription." His face darkened like a threatening prognosis, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of fear, the kind I often witnessed in patients receiving serious diagnoses. "You wouldn't really go to the authorities, would you? You wouldn't destroy your own stepfather like that?" I leaned forward, meeting his gaze with the same steady focus I maintained during delicate procedures. "Try me." For once, Marcus had no clever response. He stood up, mumbling something under his breath, and stormed out, slamming the door with enough force to rattle my framed medical license. I sank back into my chair, my heart racing like it did after a challenging surgery. The confrontation had left me shaken, but I also felt a surge of professional satisfaction. Marcus was finally beginning to realize that his usual manipulative techniques wouldn't work on me anymore. This wasn't just about the cabin, it was about standing up to someone who had been undermining my boundaries since medical school. He showed up at my apartment, I told Amelia during our video call, pacing my living room like I did during difficult consultations. Tried to spin some story about how he borrowed the cabin to settle his gambling debts. Amelia's laugh through the screen was as sharp as a surgical blade. "Borrowed? That's rich. Does he even hear himself? What did you say?" I told him the sale was invalid, and if he pushed me, I'd go to the authorities, I replied, automatically organizing my medical journals as I spoke, a habit that helped me process stressful situations. That seemed to shake him, but knowing Marcus, he's probably already plotting his next move. "Let him plot," Amelia said with the confidence of a winning legal argument. "I've contacted our lawyer to draft a formal cease and desist letter. If he tries to involve the buyer again, we'll have a legal paper trail ready to stop him." I nodded, her words grounding me like a steady pulse during surgery. "Thanks, Amelia. I don't know what I'd do without your expertise in all this." "You'd find another way," she said, "but we're stronger together, just like in our environmental protection cases." Over the next few days, I approached gathering evidence with the same methodical precision I used in documenting patient cases. Each piece of documentation was carefully organized: the co-ownership agreement, screenshots of Marcus's incriminating messages, and communications with the real estate agent. When I contacted the agent, her voice carried the nervous energy of someone confessing medical history they'd previously withheld. "Dr. Parker, I need to be clear about this," she said hastily. I had no idea about the co-ownership situation. Marcus assured me he had full authority to sell. I maintained my professional composure, the same tone I used when gathering sensitive patient information. "I understand. I'm not trying to implicate you in this. I just need to confirm, did Marcus sign the paperwork alone? Yes, she admitted, relief evident in her voice. The buyer hasn't completed payment because I flagged some irregularities in the transaction. I can provide you with all the relevant documentation. That would be very helpful, I replied, making mental notes as precisely as I would during rounds. As I ended the call, I felt the same focused determination that guided me through complex medical procedures. Marcus had counted on me being too preoccupied with my medical work to fight back, but he was about to learn just how thorough a doctor could be. Amelia's evening call brought more positive developments. The cease and desist letter is ready, she announced with the satisfaction of a successful environmental injunction. We'll send it first thing tomorrow. If he makes any more attempts to claim ownership, we'll escalate immediately. Perfect, I said, allowing myself a small smile, the kind I reserved for successful treatment outcomes. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt like I was regaining control of the situation. Marcus thought he could steamroll over my rights, but he was about to face a different kind of diagnosis, one he couldn't charm his way out of. Detective Miller's call came just as I was reviewing patient files. His voice carried the professional authority I recognized from my own field. Dr. Parker, I've reviewed the documents you and Ms. Hayes provided. The unauthorized sale attempt is clear-cut. We can proceed with a formal investigation if you wish. Yes, I replied without hesitation, the same decisiveness I used in emergency situations. I want to pursue this. We'll begin by contacting the potential buyer, Detective Miller explained, his methodical approach reminding me of consulting with fellow physicians. Based on the evidence, if Marcus continues to interfere, we'll pursue criminal charges for fraudulent misrepresentation. Thank you, Detective, I responded, unconsciously organizing my medical documents as we spoke. The systematic approach to justice felt familiar, like following a well-planned treatment protocol. Marcus's call came during my clinic hours, his voice carrying a desperate edge I'd heard in patients facing serious diagnoses. Do you have any idea what you've done, Evelyn? He demanded. You're destroying everything. No, Marcus, I replied with the calm certainty I used when explaining necessary medical procedures. I'm protecting what's mine. You created this situation yourself. You've always been so ungrateful, he sneered. I stepped in when your mother was overwhelmed, and this is how you repay me? I felt a laugh rise in my throat, as bitter as surgical antiseptic. You didn't step in, Marcus. You invaded. You manipulated and used people for your own gain, just like you're doing now. The difference is, this time there are consequences. He started to protest, but I cut him off with the same decisiveness I used in emergency situations. This conversation is over. If you have anything else to say, direct it to my lawyer. I ended the call and sat back in my office chair, my heart racing like it did after a difficult procedure. Marcus's days of manipulating me were finally coming to an end. Detective Miller's update came while I was between patient consultations. Dr. Parker, we've spoken with the buyer, he reported. They were unaware of the co-ownership agreement and have agreed to withdraw from the transaction. They're fully cooperating with our investigation. Relief washed over me like the feeling after a successful surgery. So the sale is officially void? Yes, he confirmed. The cabin remains under your and Ms. Hayes' ownership. However, we'll need to keep the case open to address your stepfather's fraudulent actions. Would you like to press charges? I paused, my mind working through the options like diagnosing a complex case. Yes, I said firmly, using the same conviction I had when recommending crucial treatments. I want him held accountable. Understood, Detective Miller replied. We'll proceed with the case. Thank you for your cooperation. After ending the call, I took a deep breath, feeling the same mix of emotions I experienced after a challenging medical intervention. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt the tension in my shoulders begin to ease. The cabin was secure, and Marcus's schemes were finally facing proper scrutiny. The sale is officially void, I told Amelia during our video call, unconsciously straightening my medical journals as I spoke. The buyer's withdrawing completely. That's excellent news, Amelia responded, her satisfaction evident. What about Marcus? The police are moving forward with their investigation, I explained, my voice carrying the same professional tone I used when discussing treatment plans. He's not getting away with this anymore. Good, she said firmly. It's about time someone held him accountable. How are you feeling about all this? Her words resonated with me, like a precise diagnosis finally clicking into place. For years, I'd allowed Marcus to operate unchecked, his manipulations, his entitlement, his complete disregard for boundaries. But this time, I'd stood my ground, using the same determination that had carried me through medical school and countless humanitarian missions. That evening, I visited the cabin for the first time since returning from Africa. As I stepped inside, the familiar scent of pine and cedar wrapped around me like a protective blanket. The sound of my footsteps on the wooden floors, the gentle creak of the door, everything reminded me of why this place meant so much. I settled into my favorite chair by the fireplace, letting the quiet of the mountains wash over me. This wasn't just a property I was defending, it was my sanctuary, where I processed difficult cases, celebrated medical breakthroughs, and found peace amid the chaos of emergency medicine. And it was still mine, despite Marcus's best efforts. Detective Miller's final update came between my morning rounds. Dr. Parker, I wanted to inform you that your stepfather has been formally charged with fraudulent misrepresentation and attempted theft of property. Given the evidence we've collected, including the documentation you and Ms. Hayes provided, the case against him is substantial. I absorbed this news with the same controlled composure I maintained during critical procedures. Thank you for everything, Detective, I said, my voice steady and professional. You handled this situation remarkably well, he noted. It's not easy to stand up to family, but you did the right thing. After ending the call, I sat in my office, surrounded by medical texts and patient files, processing the weight of everything that had transpired. Marcus had been such a dominant force in my life for years, his toxic influence as persistent as a chronic condition, and now I was finally free from his manipulations. The next day, Amelia and I met at the cabin. She arrived with a bottle of wine and the same triumphant energy she carried after winning major environmental cases. We settled on the porch, the mountain air carrying the familiar scent of pine that had always helped me decompress after difficult surgeries. To standing our ground, she said, raising her glass. And to not letting anyone push us around anymore. I clinked my glass against hers, feeling a smile spread across my face, the kind I usually reserved for delivering good news to patients. To us. As we talked, I found myself reflecting on everything I'd learned from this ordeal. Like diagnosing a complex medical condition, I'd needed to trust my instincts, gather evidence, and take decisive action. I'd spent so much of my career helping others stand up for their health and well-being, but this time I'd done it for myself. You know, Amelia said, interrupting my thoughts, this cabin has always been more than just property. It's a symbol of everything we've worked for, everything we believe in. Never let anyone take that away from you again. Her words resonated with the same clarity as a perfect diagnosis. The cabin wasn't just a retreat in the mountains, it was a testament to my independence, my resilience, and my determination to protect what mattered most. As I sat by the fireplace, watching the flames dance in the same hypnotic way that helped me process difficult cases. I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. Marcus's betrayal had tested my professional composure in ways no medical emergency ever had, but it had also shown me just how much strength I'd developed through years of handling critical situations. Life gradually settled into a new rhythm, like a patient recovering after successful treatment. The cabin, once the center of Marcus's attempted theft, became my sanctuary again. Each creak of the floorboards and whisper of wind through the trees reminded me of what I'd fought to protect. During this time, my mother called once. Her voice carried the hesitation I often heard in patients' family members struggling to accept a diagnosis. "You know how he gets, Evelyn," she said, her usual defense of Marcus sounding hollow. "I do," I replied with the same professional certainty I used when explaining treatment plans. "That's exactly why I did what I had to do." She didn't argue. For the first time, there was no attempt to mediate, no plea for understanding. Just a quiet acknowledgement before she said, "I hope you find peace." "I already have," I responded, and I meant it. Amelia and I spent the following weekends making improvements to the cabin. We repaired loose shingles, reinforced the porch railings, and planted new herbs in the garden, each one carefully selected for its medicinal properties. Every improvement felt like strengthening our claim to this place, much like building immunity against future threats. One evening, as we finished painting the porch, Amelia turned to me. "So, what's next for you, Evelyn? You've secured the cabin, stood up to Marcus, what's the next challenge?" I considered her question with the same thoughtfulness I gave to complex medical cases. "I'm going to continue doing what I love," I said, my voice carrying the confidence I'd earned through years of medical practice. Treating patients, volunteering with Doctors Without Borders, living life on my terms. But this time, I'm not letting anyone else dictate how I do it." She smiled, understanding the diagnosis behind my words. To that. As the days passed, I found myself reflecting more on everything I'd learned from this experience. It wasn't just about the cabin or even Marcus, it was about recognizing my own strength, the same way I helped patients recognize their resilience during recovery. For years, I'd let his behavior influence how much I pushed back, how much I tolerated, but now I knew I was capable of setting and maintaining boundaries, no matter how uncomfortable it made others feel. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, casting the same golden light that had witnessed countless moments of healing in this place, I stood on the porch, breathing in the crisp, pine-scented air. For the first time in years, I felt truly at home, not just in the cabin, but in my own life. The peace I found here wasn't just about the location anymore, it was about knowing I had the strength to protect what mattered, the same strength that had carried me through countless medical emergencies and humanitarian missions. As I watched the last rays of sunlight paint the sky, I knew that this wasn't just an ending to Marcus's chapter in my life, it was the beginning of my own story, written on my own terms.